Isaiah 47, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground. There is no throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called tender and delicate. Take the millstones and grind meal, uncover thy locks, make bare the leg, uncover the thigh, pass over the rivers. Thy nakedness shall be uncovered, yea, thy shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will not meet thee as a man. As for our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel. Sit thou silent and get thee into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called the Lady of Kingdoms. I was wroth with my people, I have polluted mine inheritance, and have given them into thine hand. Thou didst show them no mercy. Upon the ancient hast thou very heavily laid thy yoke. And thou sayest, I shall be a lady forever, so that thou didst not lay these things to thy heart, neither didst remember the latter end of it. Therefore hear now this, thou that art given to pleasures, that dwellest carelessly, that sayest in thine heart, I am, and none else beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, neither shall I know the loss of children. But these two things shall come to thee in a moment, in one day, the loss of children and widowhood. They shall come upon thee in their perfection, for the multitude of thy sorceries and for the great abundance of thine enchantments. For thou hast trusted in thy wickedness. Thou hast said, none seeth me. Thy wisdom and thy knowledge, it hath perverted thee. And thou hast said in thine heart, I am, and none else beside me. Therefore shall evil come upon thee. Thou shalt not know from whence it riseth, and mischief shall fall upon thee. Thou shalt not be able to put it off, and desolation shall come upon thee suddenly, which thou shalt not know. Stand now with thine enchantments, and with the multitude of thy sorceries, wherein thou hast labored from thy youth. If so be thou shalt be able to profit, if so be thou mayest prevail. Thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, and the monthly prognosticators stand up, and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee. Behold, they shall be as stubble. The fire shall burn them. They shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There shall not be a coal to warm at, nor fire to sit before it. Thus shall they be unto thee with whom thou hast labored, even thy merchants from thy youth. They shall wander every one to his quarter. None shall save thee." So, what we saw in chapters 36 through 39, the historical interlude, we saw King Hezekiah, at the very end of that, we saw him show these Babylonian emissaries all the great wonders and treasures. And we know that that is what led to the Babylonians being very instrumental in God's judgment of the kingdom of Judah, and very specifically the city and the people of Jerusalem. And so we're seeing here prophecies about Babylon, and specifically this is a judgment of Babylon for what they will do, in the same way that it was prophesied against Assyria, that they would be judged after God had judged Israel. Babylon will also be judged after he has judged Judah, not because he's making them do something and then judging them for what he made them do. That's not the case. It's the exact same situation with Assyria. They are an instrument of God's judgment, but they sin, and they continually sin, and they heap upon their sins. And so we look here in verse 1. It says, "Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground. There is no throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called tender and delicate." And so the reason here that Babylon is called a virgin, because as we should know from all of our various studies, Babylon was not a pure place. It was a place full of paganism, full of idolatry, and we'll discuss some of that as we get down toward the end of the chapter. But it was a place of great sin, and it was a place where idolatry sort of emanated, sort of began. This worship of false gods began here and spread throughout the world. So the reference here to calling Babylon a virgin daughter is not about any kind of moral purity or even sexual purity. This is specifically making a reference to the fact that Babylon had never been overtly invaded, conquered, and destroyed in war up to this time. Yes, they had been kind of under the thumb of the Assyrians, because the Assyrians were the nation on top in Mesopotamia, in that land in the Middle East. But once they rose to power, they did that, and they had never been overtly conquered with much violence. So God says, "You are a virgin," and the implication there is that period, that time period, that blessing, that security that they enjoy, it's going to end. They will be conquered, and it will be violent. It says, "There is no throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called tender and delicate." So he's likening Babylon here to a young, tender, and delicate woman, to a virgin. We see that language in other places in Scripture. But this is, again, specifically talking about, the national security. It says, "Take the millstones and grind meal, uncover thy locks, make bare the leg, uncover the thigh, pass over the rivers. Thy nakedness shall be uncovered, yea, thy shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will not meet thee as a man." And so, keeping with that, whether you want to call it an allegory, a metaphor, whatever you want to call it, where Babylon is pictured here as a virgin, what a great shame to a pure virgin woman, or even a virgin man, would be to have their nakedness uncovered and to be forced to have that uncovered in front of people. In Babylon's case, it would be in front of the world. They would be forced to become slaves, it may be talking about the individual people here, that their nakedness is uncovered, but I believe specifically what we're seeing is God is talking about the nakedness of the nation itself. Their weaknesses will be exposed. Their security will be violated. They will be taken. They will be conquered. They will be put under the thumb violently. And it says in verse 4, "As for our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel." And so, we'll read verse 5 before we get into that. It says, "Sit thou silent, and get thee into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called the Lady of Kingdoms." And so this is the case. When we see Babylon being described in the book of Revelation, there is no mistaking. There is no mistaking Babylon for a virgin at that time. Because Babylon is, is pictured as the harlot, the whore, the unpure, the unsecure, the unsafe, the immoral, the evil. It is not seen as a pure, secure, safe, wonderful place. It simply is not. And so I believe, while you can draw some parallels between this chapter and what you see in Revelation chapter 17 and chapter 18, there definitely are parallels. I do believe that there is some dual application here. I think primarily what we're reading about is a local prophecy specific to the Babylon of the Chaldean people, the Babylon of antiquity, of ancient history, not the Babylon that is yet to come. So we see here, again in verse 4, "As for our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel." God will redeem them from Babylon. Remember, we've studied throughout the past few weeks that Cyrus, king of Persia, the Persians and the Medes, specifically the Medes, overthrew Babylon, and then the Persians kind of took over after the Medes. They were kind of cousins to the Medes. And then Cyrus, that Persian king, allowed them to go back. God was their redeemer. That was at that was God's will. It was not merely Cyrus's will. It was God's will for that to happen. But we see here in verse 6, and God will explain this. It says, I was wroth with my people, I have polluted mine inheritance, and have given them into thine hand. Now, this is what we said. This is exactly, what we've studied regarding Israel and Assyria. It was God's will that they should be delivered into the hand of the Assyrians, the 10 northern tribes, just as Isaiah has said it, and as Jeremiah goes into it again and again and again and again and again throughout his prophecies. God would have Judah delivered into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, of the Babylonians, of the Chaldeans. There was no mistaking it. And so God says he was wroth with his people. He says he gave them into the hands of the Babylonians. He did that for judgment, but it says, thou didst show them no mercy. Upon the ancient hast thou very heavily laid thy yoke. And thou sayest, I shall be a lady forever, so that thou didst not lay these things to thy heart, neither didst remember the latter end of it. And so what he's saying is, Babylon became proud. Babylon became arrogant. Babylon became puffed up in itself, which is exactly the same thing that happened to Assyria. Oh, look and how mighty and wonderful we are, because we were able to conquer this nation. They weren't even, they were supposed to be this great nation. We've heard tales of their King David and all of his exploits, and look now how they've fallen and how we have risen to be on top, how we are the mighty ones. That's kind of the attitude of the Assyrians. And that's here the attitude of the Babylonians. They've kind of taken over the Assyrians by this point in history, when Nebuchadnezzar becomes in charge and he's able to conquer Jerusalem. They've already taken over the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire has already fallen by the wayside. So they have that same attitude. And, it's... However, the judgment that they executed on these people, on the people of Judah and Jerusalem, it was God's will to judge them, but everything that the Babylonians did was not within God's will. You can see that right here. It says, thou didst show them no mercy. Upon the ancient hast thou very heavily laid thy yoke. They didn't just conquer the nation. They humiliated the nation. They humiliated Judah. And they I believe, from this, God is saying they went too far. They did more than what a nation is supposed to do when it conquers another in war. And so the example given here is they took the very oldest of the people and they put them into hard labor. Now, you don't even get any benefit out of making an old person do very hard labor. The only thing that you're doing is killing them. In fact, the time that it takes to manage the very old and to supervise and to watch them. If you ever have to supervise anyone on any kind of job, it's hard enough just to do that. You start adding old people to the mix that aren't going to get any work done, you're just wasting time. So it actually becomes even worse for you to do that. So you're just wasting your own time. There's sin right there. And then you're causing unnecessary pain and death to other people. And so I think that's why God uses that as an example there. We can see, though, that God's plan was for Judah to be very heavily judged. You can read about that in Habakkuk chapter 1, and we'll read a few verses here in Habakkuk chapter 1, starting in verse 5. Remember, at the beginning of the book of Habakkuk, he's saying, Lord, how long are you going to make me wait? These people that you have me prophesying to, they're just so evil. They need to be judged. I've had it, Lord. I can't stand it. And so the Lord says here in verse 5, starting here in verse 5, behold ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which ye will not believe, though it be told to you. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. Their horses also are swifter than the leopards, and are more fierce than the evening wolves. And their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from far, and they shall fly as the eagle that hasteth to eat. They shall come all for violence. Their faces shall sup up as the east wind, and they shall gather the captivity as the sand, and they shall scoff at the kings, and the princes shall be a scorn unto them. They shall deride every stronghold, for they shall heap dust and take it. Then shall his mind change, and he shall pass over and offend, imputing this his power unto his God. And so what we see here is God says, I'm going to let them do this. I'm going to let them have the run of the land. They're going to come and they're just going to take it, and it's going to be easy for them. But, what we see here is in verse 11, his mind changes. He shall pass over and offend, imputing this, his power, unto his God. And so there's the explanation right there. You look at verse 6 here in Isaiah chapter 47, and you read those verses in Habakkuk, and it's very clear, and I've said it and I'll say it again, it's the exact same kind of situation that you see with Assyria and the northern kingdoms. They take that and they look at it and they see, oh, well, look how great and strong we are. And they believe that it's themselves and their own pagan gods that gave them this power. And they don't understand that it was God's will behind their backs, in their sails, pushing them forward, allowing them to do this. If at any time God wanted them to stop, if at any time he'd said, you know what, you're judged, end of story, in the middle of that, well, that would have been the end of it. They couldn't have won. You see, how do you know that? You look at Assyria. God said that they would judge the 10 northern tribes. He also said he would use them against the southern tribes. But he said that they wouldn't accomplish their goals. And what happened? Well, he sent an angel of death and slew 180,000 people. And they died. And that was the end of it. He could do that at any time. If his will were to change about judging the people of Judah, that could have been done at any time. But his will was to judge them. And that was the fact. So we see that, and he makes that clear in verse 7 that they didn't lay those things to heart. And so he says in verse 8, Therefore hear now this, thou that art given to pleasures, that dwellest carelessly, that sayest in thine heart, I am, and none else beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, neither shall I know the loss of children. But these two things shall come to thee in a moment, in one day, the loss of children and widowhood. They shall come upon thee in their perfection, for the multitude of thy sorceries and for the great abundance of thine enchantments. And so we'll get back to the sorceries and enchantments when we get down to verse 12 here. But those are the examples that God gives. He says, you are a pagan nation full of evil. You have all these sorceries and enchantments. You showed no mercy whenever you conquered my people. And so you're going to have to be judged. He says in verse 10, For thou hast trusted in thy wickedness. Thou hast said, None seeth me. Thy wisdom and thy knowledge, it hath perverted thee, and thou hast said in thine heart, I am, and none else beside me. That's a very, very easy place for a strong nation to fall into. It's a very easy trap to get caught in. I believe the United States is in constant danger of falling into that trap. Well, you can look at it, and if you compare the amount of money that we spend on national defense versus the amount of money that every other nation in the world spends on national defense, we eclipse them by many factors. Factors of the tens, the 20s, the 30s, hundreds. For some smaller nations, by the thousands. And even greater factors than that. We spend an enormous amount of money, and we trust in that. We trust in that to keep us safe. We trust in that. We trust in the Pacific Ocean to the west, the Atlantic Ocean to the east, a friendly nation to the north, a somewhat friendly nation to the south. We trust in those things, and we think, well, aren't we just safe? Don't we just have it so good? At any moment where there's some kind of shift in the geopolitical situation, depending on who says what on one day or who wakes up on the wrong side of the bed another day, that could change. With the technology that exists today, we've gone beyond the ICBM, the intercontinental ballistic missile. We've gone beyond that. Where missiles can travel from an enemy nation all the way around the globe in a matter of hours. They've got that down now to where some can travel in a matter of minutes. I'm not trying to scare anybody this morning, but there are possibilities that could shake the very foundation of the way we think about our own national security. I think that the United States is in danger of falling into this same trap that Assyria fell into, but that the Chaldeans, that the Babylonians would eventually fall into. You see, we're not going to go read it in Daniel this morning, but Nebuchadnezzar, he thought he was just the king of the world. And then what happened to him? God took his mind away from him. He lived as a beast in the field for 7 years with some form of, I don't know if it's amnesia or what it was, but he was a psychiatric patient, or he needed to be. And God can do any number of things to change the situation in this world. Satan can do any number of things to change the situation in this world. It's not all just about us and what we do. There are many, many factors involved in those things, but not to get too far into the weeds on that this morning. But it says in verse 11, "Therefore shall evil come upon thee. Thou shalt not know from whence it riseth, and mischief shall fall upon thee. Thou shalt not be able to put it off, and desolation shall come upon thee suddenly, which thou shalt not know." And so do you remember what happened with the Chaldeans? The Chaldeans were in charge under Nebuchadnezzar, and then Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belteshazzar. It was either Belteshazzar or Belshazzar. I don't want to get that wrong, so we'll go over and we will look at the book of Daniel, actually, because I don't want to confuse Nebuchadnezzar's son with Daniel's name. Belshazzar was the name of Nebuchadnezzar's son. So Belshazzar, he was holding this great big party, and then the enemy army marched into the party, and that was the end of Belshazzar. He was not a great king. He was not a wise king. That nation had trusted in the strength of Nebuchadnezzar, and they just kind of kept trusting in Belshazzar, and he kind of just had the attitude, well, look how strong we are, look how big we are, look how mighty we are. They weren't strong and big and mighty for very long. God allowed that to happen. So he said that thou shalt not be able to put it off, and desolation shall come upon thee suddenly, which thou shalt not know. The Medes marched in. We've talked about this multiple times. There are differing understandings of just exactly how violent the Median conqueror of Babylon was when they wrested that from the control of the Chaldeans. I personally don't believe it was an all-out massacre of the entire city. From what I understand and from what the Bible says, there was violence involved for sure, and the violence that was there was bloody and there was carnage, but they didn't go throughout the whole city. It's like they made a beeline right to the palace, and basically anybody in their way, that was the end of them. And when they got to the palace, anybody in their way, that was the end of them. And when they got to Belshazzar, he was in their way, and that was the end of him. And so there was carnage and there was blood, but they didn't spread out throughout the whole city and fight this great prolonged battle. It happened just like it's described here in the book of Isaiah. They came in, and before the Chaldeans knew what was happening, the Medes had already taken it. So now in verse 12 it says, "Stand now with thine enchantments and with the multitude of thy sorceries, wherein thou hast labored from thy youth. If so be, thou shalt be able to profit. If so be, thou mayest prevail." And before I discuss this, I want to read verse 13 as well. It says, "Thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee. And so, I hope nobody raises their hand. How many of you read your horoscope this morning? Okay, that's good. The horoscope and the idea of the horoscope, the zodiac, all of those things can be traced back to Babylon. So we see here in verse 13, astrologers, stargazers, and monthly, and I like that word, prognosticators. And if you're confused about what a prognosticator is, it's somebody that's giving a prognosis, somebody who's saying, this is what's going to happen. This is what we believe is happening now. This is what we understand to be the case. When you get a prognosis from a doctor, they're estimating what's going to happen to you in the near future based on your current condition. When you get a diagnosis, they're saying this is what you've already got. So a prognosticator is somebody who's offering a prognosis on the state of affairs, either with a particular nation, with a person, with the world at large. Doesn't really matter. They're making a guess. Yeah, and Punxsutawney Phil is called the prognosticator of prognosticators. I knew somebody would bring that up. Yes, exactly. I would like to say it's nothing more than a guess, but when we go back to verse 12, we see, stand now with thine enchantments and with the multitude of thy sorceries, wherein thou hast labored from thy youth. If so be, thou shalt be able to profit. If so be, thou mayest prevail. And so God challenges the Babylonians. He says, these powers that you have, these things that you have had, he says, wherein thou hast labored from thy youth. I believe, personally, again, all of this goes back to the very Tower of Babel itself that was set up under Nimrod. And I believe that it was Nimrod and his family. I believe his wife played a very significant role. Her name was Semiramis. In creating and setting up this false religion that completely overtook the world in the form of many different religions, but all boils down to this one original Babylonian religion focused on a group of gods and a one-world government. Don't want to get too far into that this morning, but that's the source of it. You know, it's long been associated with Babylon. These magics, witchcrafts, sorceries, enchantments. That's what's being described here. Now we know, and we'll look at Revelation chapter 18 very quickly. Revelation chapter 18, verses 20 to 23. This same kind of thing is said about the Babylon of the future, the Babylon of the tribulation period. Revelation chapter 18, starting in verse 20. Revelation 18, beginning in verse 20, it says, Rejoice over her, thou heaven, and ye holy apostles and prophets, for God hath avenged you on her. And a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone, and cast it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence shall that great city Babylon be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all. It says, And the voice of harpers and musicians and of pipers and trumpeters shall be heard no more at all in thee, and no craftsman of whatsoever craft he be shall be found any more in thee, and the sound of a millstone shall be heard no more at all in thee. And the light of a candle shall shine no more at all in thee, and the voice of the bridegroom and of the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee. For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, for by thy sorceries were all nations deceived. And so there's a reason why God calls this place, this system, this group, this organization, this city, Babylon, in the New Testament, because it's a mirror, it's an image, it's a carbon copy of the original. So we know we see that here, and we see that this pagan religion completely permeates this nation, completely permeates the society. We're warned. I believe, against taking things like this too lightly. Because people today might see this and they say, oh, astrology. Anybody with any sense knows that you're not going to find out the future by reading your horoscope. Anybody with any sense knows that. Anybody with any sense knows that the stars are not going to tell you the future. But there are people who still today will get palm readings. They will still read their horoscopes. Even those who don't believe in it, they'll read it for fun. There are people who will go and have a tarot card ritual done to have somebody prognosticate on what's going to happen. And so we're warned about that by Paul, by many people in the Bible, but I want to focus specifically on what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, because this goes directly together with it. What Paul is talking specifically here about idolatry, but remember, all of these things that we read about here in Isaiah, the astrology, the stargazing, the prognosticating, the enchantments, and the sorceries, it's all a form of idolatry. So we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we'll first read verse 8. It says, "Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day," verse 7, "Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." Verse 14, "Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry." Verses 18 through 20, "Behold, Israel after the flesh, are not they which eat of sacrifices partakers of the altar? What say I then, that the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything? But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God, and I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils." And then if you look at verse 21, it says, "Ye cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Ye cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils." And so he says, things sacrificed to idols, these people aren't just sacrificing it to the piece of wood or the piece of stone or the piece of metal that's in front of them. This thing that's worthless, that we know is worthless from what we've read in the book of Isaiah, from what we understand throughout all Scripture. These things are made by men. They're absolutely worthless. But we know Satan has power. We know that the beings under his control have power. And so when they're sacrificing to these idols, they're not merely sacrificing to idols. There are real beings either that can possibly, I don't want to get too far into it, but can possibly either inhabit the idols or cause the idols to respond, or maybe not even that, but can in some way spiritually interact with the people that are trying to interact with the idol. There is a real satanic, demonic, devilish power behind some of these things. Not in every case is it 100% satanic spiritual power. Sometimes I think that it's just people's imaginations going too far. But the Bible is clear that Satan is real, his demons are real, his devils are real. Very clear that they do have power. Very clear that there is constant warfare in our world between the angelic forces and the demonic forces. It's invisible to us. We don't have eyes that can see that. But it's still happening. One thing that I think is interesting, a while back I talked about the expansion of the universe, and how their best explanation for the expansion of the universe is dark energy. And all that means is they just don't know where it comes from, and they don't know what it is. But something is causing the universe to expand. There's another concept, and it's called dark matter. And they can see it because they can see the effects that dark matter has through the Hubble telescope. They can look at galaxies and star systems, and they can see that something is causing behaviors to appear in these star systems, in the way that they rotate around one another, in the way that they revolve around one another, in the way that they rotate, in the way that they interact physically with one another. There is some kind of physical concept that's causing this to happen. They call it dark matter. And they call it dark matter because they don't know what it is. And they've theorized that every second of every day, every millisecond, every nanosecond of every day, there is dark matter that doesn't physically interact with the matter that we perceive. And it's flowing, if I hold up my hand, there's dark matter flowing through my hand. It doesn't physically interact with the molecules, the atoms, the protons, the neutrons, the nuclei. It doesn't physically interact with the electrons. It doesn't have that. It's got a different kind of charge to it, and the light doesn't bounce off of it, so we can't see it because it doesn't interact with photons. But it's there, according to some of these theories. I don't know if it's true, but if it is, to me that makes perfect sense how angels and demons can be in this world in a physical way, but yet we don't understand how they're interacting. Again, I'm not trying to prove anything, but I think that there's an interesting concept there, that an angel could be standing right here, a demon could be standing right beside him. I don't know. I could be waving my hand right through him. He could be laughing at me right now. I don't know. I'm just saying that would provide a scientific explanation for, how these things could happen. Give us a way to maybe start to wrap our mind around, how it could be possible that angels and demons coexist with us on this earth, but yet we don't have any perceivable interactions with them, at least most of the time. So, that being said, there's also, specifically getting back to Isaiah chapter 47, when we read about enchantments and sorceries. Now, just about every time we see the word sorcery in the Bible, I'm very keen to mention it. I know Ron's very keen to mention it. In the New Testament, when you see the word sorceries, it's tied to the Greek word pharmakia, from which we get our word for pharmacy, or pharmacist, or pharmacology, the drugs, and it's often mentioned in whenever I've taught or whenever Ron's preached or taught about demon possession or about sorcery. There's this idea that, you take a physical substance and it alters your state of being, it alters your consciousness, and that's a form of demonic possession. That is true. I believe that, the use of drugs is highly connected to demon possession, and I believe it is a form of demon possession. I don't believe it's the only form of demon possession. So, I don't want anybody to think that when we see here enchantments and sorceries that we're just talking about, a witch with a cauldron concocting some kind of substance that alters your mind. There are real, especially in the Bible, there are real instances of people being physically inhabited by a demon. Or maybe it's some dark matter demon through the power of Satan is able to, convert its matter into something that can physically interact with our matter. That's all just me making that up. I don't know. But that's just kind of how I've come to start to understand this. I could be completely wrong. Could be some other satanic power or some other spiritual power that we have no way of even trying to consider. But that being said, I do believe, I wanted to make the point that I don't believe sorcery is merely drug use, but I am going to give you an example of how I think that drug use can kind of fit into this. There's a substance out there called dimethyltryptamine, also known as DMT. It's the dimethyltryptamine. DMT stands for that word. From what I understand, our bodies actually will manufacture it in infinitesimally small amounts, and it's involved with our dream state. And so our brain, whenever we have dimethyltryptamine in our brain when we're dreaming, that's kind of what we see all these things in our sleep. even though our physical eyes aren't looking at it, our brain is perceiving all of these images and events as if it's real, as if we are actually a human being looking at these things, touching these things, feeling these things, sometimes tasting or smelling, depending on how much chemicals you have going on in your brain at night. And I'm not trying to teach a biology lesson, but this is just from my limited understanding how I understand that it works. People will, it's very hard to access, but there are some people who will take dimethyltryptamine as a recreational drug. And it will cause them to have very extreme psychedelic experiences beyond what most people would take mushrooms for. And DMT is also found in ayahuasca leaves, which grow in South America. And so I'm explaining all that to explain this. There have been accounts where people have taken DMT and they had not talked to one another. They didn't know each other before. They did not collaborate before with what they were going to say to the scientists whenever they got out of this DMT experiment. But they almost all, I think it was 95% of them, out of this study that was done, it's been years ago, whenever they got out of their trip, they said that they met people that were like elves or aliens or some kind of other beings that were similar to humans, that spoke with them and communed with them. And these humans said, "We're so glad you're here to talk with us. We're so glad that you're here because we want you to understand that there is more to what's going on." And they presented themselves to be good. Now, I don't know if that's some way, again, that you can take a physical substance that exists on this earth that allows your brain to connect to these spiritual beings that we normally aren't able to perceive. Maybe it literally is just a fever dream. Maybe. That's very possible. It may be just merely effects of drug inducement. But what I think is really interesting is the fact that all of these people had the same experience. And they didn't talk about it beforehand. They didn't take notes. They weren't prompted to use that as their story of what happened. It just kind of happened that way. So, is there something there that you can kind of tie, biblically into? Well, that's what we're talking about when we talk about sorceries. We're talking about this, trying to ascend to a higher plane of existence, to a different plane of existence, if not higher. I don't know. I don't know. I'm just saying that I personally think that there are examples out there that may be related to these kind of things. So you can take that for what you will. I mentioned ayahuasca. That was, there have been traditions, and they actually have shamans in South America. It goes all the way back to the ancient Aztecs. They have, and all in these South American natives, they have stories of communing, and you look at the Mayan temples, they're very similar to the ziggurats, which were built by the Babylonians, these stepped pyramid-type structures. I don't know if that's for a reason. I couldn't tell you. What I can tell you is that I do believe satanic power is real from Scripture. I do believe that demons are real from Scripture. I do believe they have interacted with people from Scripture, and I believe that it's possible that there are connections to all of those things. Could be wrong. Could be wildly wrong. Could be wasting everybody's time this morning. But when I was reading here about the enchantments and the sorceries and the kind of things that Babylon used to do, that was what I immediately thought of. And so I've actually been thinking about that for a while now, that there might be some explanation that one day we might figure out before the rapture of how some of this stuff works. We're not going to figure out everything, and we may be completely off the mark, but that's kind of how I understand it as of right now. So we'll finish out the chapter now, going into verse 14. "Behold, they shall be as stubble, the fire shall burn them, they shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There shall not be a coal to warm at, nor a fire to sit before it. Thus shall they be unto thee, with whom thou hast labored, even thy merchants. From thy youth they shall wander every one to his quarter, none shall save thee. There isn't going to be any hope. There isn't going to be any salvation for these people once God decides to judge them. Similarly to how once people get to the great white throne judgment, that's the end. They've reached the limit. There is no more. There's no more room to be saved. There's no more room to ask for forgiveness. There is only eternal judgment for those who face God at the great white throne. That's the same kind of ultimatum that's here. God says, this nation, I've made the decree. This is what's going to happen. It's done. So, none shall save thee. And that's the end of it. So, we do see some judgment here of Babylon. And that's kind of the basic point of this chapter. And the reason for the judgment is because of their sins, not because God made them do anything that he would have to judge them for. So that's chapter 47. Are there any questions or comments?